This is the story of Marshall Eldon Voss and his wife Selwyn Voss, née Calloway. They built something careful together, a life that looked, from certain angles, like exactly what both of them had wanted. Marshall was the kind of man who paid attention to small things, the way Selwyn took her coffee, which side of the bed she preferred in winter versus summer, the specific silence she needed after a hard day at work. Selwyn loved him for that attentiveness, and for a long time, she mistook it for enough. What neither of them examined closely was the arrangement that had quietly formed around her family, her parents, her brother, the old gravitational pull of the Calloway household, and how much of Selwyn's energy flowed in that direction, and how much of Marshall's patience had been slowly, invisibly spent. Their daughter Bria was 7 years old and already learning, the way children do without knowing they're learning, that the adults around her operated on separate clocks. The tension in this story is not loud. It never announces itself. It arrives the way water does, finding the lowest place, settling there, and staying. The school was 4 blocks from Selwyn's parents' house, which was how the arrangement had started. Practically, sensibly, the way most arrangements do before they become something else. Brea attended Whitmore Elementary, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Selwyn's shift at the hospital ran until 5:30 and Marshall's commute from the architecture firm made pickup impossible without someone burning through traffic and arriving flustered, Diane and Gerald Calloway, Selwyn's parents, would walk the 4 blocks and collect their granddaughter. It had seemed 2 years ago when they proposed it, like a gift. Diane had said, "We're right there, Selwyn. Let us be useful." Gerald had nodded with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoys solving logistical problems. It had worked. For a while, it had worked beautifully. Selwyn remembered the early days of the arrangement with something close to gratitude. Bria coming home smelling like her mother's kitchen, her backpack full of drawings she'd made at the table while Diane cooked. Gerald's voice in the background of the phone call reading her the weather report as though Selwyn were still 12 and couldn't check it herself. There was comfort in the predictability of it. There was also, she would later understand, a kind of willful inattention she'd been practicing. Not lying to herself exactly, but choosing, repeatedly, not to look at things directly. Marshall had noticed before she had. That was the honest version. He'd mentioned it the first time almost a year ago, in the quiet after Bria had gone to bed, when the apartment held the particular stillness of a Tuesday night with dishes done and nothing urgent left to perform. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and his tablet, not working, just existing, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking something through, and Selwyn had been moving around the kitchen wiping counters that were already clean, which was what she did when she was avoiding a feeling she hadn't named yet. "That's the 3rd time this month," he'd said. She hadn't needed to ask what he meant. The 3rd time her parents had been late. Not dramatically, not dangerously. 15 minutes the first time, 20 the second, nearly 40 the third. That last occasion ending with Bria sitting outside the school's front entrance on a concrete step while the last teacher stood with her, checking her watch. They lost track of time, Selwyn had said. Dad gets into things. Marshall had looked at her the way he sometimes did, not with judgment exactly, but with a careful steadiness, like a man measuring whether the floor beneath him was sound. "She was outside alone for part of that," he said. "The teacher had to stay late." "I know." Selwyn had put the cloth down. "I'll talk to them." She had talked to them, briefly, gently, in the way she'd always talked to her parents about difficult things, which was to say, she'd raised the subject, let her mother redirect it with reassurance, and allowed herself to be reassured. "We'll be more careful, sweetheart." Her father had looked mildly offended, then mildly apologetic, then had asked if she wanted to stay for dinner. She had stayed for dinner. Marshall hadn't said anything when she got home. He'd asked how it went, and she'd said, "Fine, I think they understood." And he'd nodded and gone back to whatever he was reading, and she had watched the side of his face for a moment and thought, with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been managing multiple households' worth of emotional labor, he doesn't understand how complicated they are. She was right. He didn't fully understand, but he understood something she wasn't ready to yet. That night, Bria padded into the living room in her socks and climbed into Marshall's lap with a book about a fox who kept trying to convince forest animals he was trustworthy. Marshall read it with her in the low lamplight, doing voices, and Bria laughed at the fox's excuses. Selwyn stood in the doorway watching them and felt something she couldn't name. Something that was partly love and partly a strange unease, as though she were watching a scene from a life that required more honesty than she was currently offering it. She went to bed before they finished the book. The incidents continued. That was the word Selwyn eventually started using privately, in her own mind. Incidents, because it felt clinical and therefore manageable, and because failures felt like an accusation she wasn't ready to direct at her parents. By the time Bria started second grade, the count was at 4. By November, 7. Each one came with an explanation that was technically plausible. Diane's knee had been acting up. Gerald had gotten caught on a call. Traffic on Birchwood had been impossible. The pharmacy line. A neighbor who needed help. Each explanation was offered with the specific texture of people who are not lying but are also not telling the whole truth. And Selwyn had spent enough years with these two people to understand the difference. She understood it and set it aside, repeatedly, with increasing effort. Marshall had stopped commenting after the 5th one. That was its own kind of message, but Selwyn was fluent enough in her own avoidance to not decode it in real time. What she did instead was call her parents after each incident and have a version of the same conversation. Firmer each time, she told herself. Though looking back, she would not be sure that was true, and returned to the apartment carrying the low-grade tension of someone who has handled a thing by touching it briefly and walking away. Bria, for her part, said little. She was a quiet child, observant in the way quiet children often are, and she had begun, Selwyn noticed, to ask on Tuesday mornings, "Is Grandma definitely coming today?" Not anxiously, just precisely. The way a person asks when they have learned that confirmation and certainty are not the same thing. That question, asked in a 7-year-old's voice on a Tuesday morning in late November, was the thing that finally landed in Selwyn's chest with its full weight. She had answered yes, definitely, and gone to work, and spent the first hour of her shift thinking about the specific expression on her daughter's face when she'd asked. Not worried, not fearful, just careful, learning already to hold expectations loosely. That was the hairline crack, not a break, not yet, just the place where, if you pressed, the surface gave. The 8th incident happened on a gray Thursday in December when Selwyn was in the middle of a 12-hour shift and her phone buzzed with a call from the school's front desk. A woman named Patricia, whose voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering news they've delivered before. "Bria hasn't been picked up," Patricia said. "It's 4:10. Selwyn's shift ended at 5:30. Marshall was in a client meeting that couldn't be interrupted. She'd called Patricia back and asked her to please wait. She was trying to reach her parents, and she'd called her mother 3 times before Diane picked up, sounding slightly out of breath and not at all alarmed. "Oh, we're on our way now, sweetheart. We just ran a little behind." "Behind from where?" A small pause. "We were helping your brother move some boxes into storage." Selwyn had stood in the hallway outside the break room with her phone pressed to her ear and her hand flat against the painted cinder block. Wallen said, very quietly, "You were helping Corbin move boxes." "He needed help today specifically, Sel. The storage place had a mom. We're almost there." She'd hung up and stood there a moment, staring at the wall. Then she'd gone back to work, because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. And the shift still had 90 minutes left. And Bria was fine, was going to be fine, was sitting in the front office probably drawing on the back of a permission slip. She had not told Marshall that night. She'd said her parents had been a little late. She'd handled it. It wasn't a big deal. He'd looked at her over the dinner table with that measuring look and said, "Okay," and she had watched the word land between them like something dropped from a height. No damage visible, but you couldn't be sure about what was underneath. What she'd said next, she couldn't entirely explain afterward. She'd been passing Brea, the bread basket, and something had shifted in her, some small internal loosening of a grip she'd been holding. And she'd said, almost to herself, "I don't know how many more times I can have the same conversation with them." Marshall had been quiet for a moment. Then, what would it take for you to stop having it? Meaning what? Meaning, what would have to happen before you changed the arrangement? She hadn't answered. Bria had asked for more butter, and the moment had passed, but it hadn't disappeared. It had just moved somewhere else, the way things do when they've been said, but not resolved. Later, after Bria was in bed, Selwyn sat on the couch with her laptop open and a document on the screen she wasn't reading, and Marshall came and sat at the other end, not close, not distant, just occupying the same space in the way two people do when they're thinking separately about the same thing. I grew up watching her do this, Selwyn said, not looking up. Do what? Rearrange her priorities and then not know she'd done it. She paused. My dad does it too. They'll genuinely believe they were doing their best. That's the part that's hard. Marshall was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that doesn't make it safer for Bria. I know. And it doesn't mean. He stopped. Reconsidered. It doesn't mean your feelings about it have to be the same as your explanation for it. She looked at him then. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her. And there was something in his profile, something careful and slightly worn, that she recognized as the face of a man who had been patient for a long time and was being patient still, but was becoming, slowly, a different kind of tired. You think I'm making excuses for them, she said. I think you understand them so well that you've started doing it for them. She turned back to her laptop. The silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was its own kind of thing. Maybe she started, then stopped. Something odd crossed her face. She looked up, not quite at Marshall. Not quite at anything in the room. More like through the room, at some awareness beyond it. I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something. Her voice had changed registers briefly, like a signal crossing a bad frequency. Marshall turned and looked at her. What? She blinked. Her expression resettled, like a curtain falling back into place. Sorry. I don't know why I said that. Subscribe to what? Nothing. She shook her head once. I don't know. Forget it. He looked at her a moment longer, then turned away. Whatever had just happened, it was over, and the apartment was quiet again, and outside the window, the December street was wet and orange lit and indifferent. I'll get a tracking app, she said finally, on their phones, so I can see if they leave the house on time. Marshall was quiet for a moment. They'll agree to that? I'll frame it as convenience. He nodded slowly, as though this were a reasonable plan, which it was. And also, she understood from the careful way he was not saying anything further, a plan that should have been implemented several incidents ago. He didn't say that. He just nodded and eventually got up to refill his water, and she stayed on the couch until 11 with the laptop still open, thinking about the difference between explaining people and protecting your child from them. She installed the app in January, framed as a family location sharing thing, so we can all see each other. It'll be easier for everyone. Her mother had accepted cheerfully. Her father had grumbled briefly and then accepted. Her brother Corbin, who had been included in the group because not including him would have raised questions, had accepted without comment. She checked it idly for the first 2 weeks. Her parents' location would show their house, then the school, then back. The route was exactly right, the timing roughly correct. She'd relaxed. She'd thought maybe the conversations had finally landed. Maybe the directness of the app's presence, the implicit knowledge that she could see, had changed something. The 9th incident happened on a Tuesday in late January. She'd been at work when Patricia called again, her voice the same flat register, conveying the same information, and Selwyn had opened the app immediately, and there it was. Her parents' shared location, a blue dot sitting at a strip mall on the far side of town, clustered near a furniture store that Selwyn happened to know her brother had been looking at for his new apartment. They were furniture shopping with Corbin. While Bria sat in the front office of an elementary school waiting. Selwyn had stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she'd called her mother. We're almost. I can see where you are, Mom. The silence that followed had a specific quality. the quality of a person recalibrating, rapidly. "We just made a quick stop. I can see where you are," Selwyn repeated, very quietly. "You're at the furniture place on Kettler. You're with Corbin." Another silence. Then, "Selwyn, sweetheart, it was just. This is the 9th time." She kept her voice low, the way she'd learned to keep her voice when she was most serious. Not softer because she was backing down, but quieter because she needed it to arrive clearly. "She is 9 years old. She's waiting outside. She's inside. They keep them." "That's not the point." She heard her father's voice in the background, asking what was happening. She heard her mother's hand go over the phone, a muffled exchange, the familiar texture of her parents conferring privately while she waited on the line. A thing they had done her entire life, a thing she had never once named as what it was. "We're leaving now," her mother said. Selwyn had ended the call and looked at the app for another moment. The blue dot had not moved. It moved 2 minutes later. That night she told Marshall, not everything at once. She wasn't built for all at once, and neither was the conversation. But she told him what the app had shown and what her mother had said, and what she was beginning to understand that she had not let herself understand before. He listened in the way he listened when something important was being said, not filling silence, not redirecting, just present with it. "It was always Corbin," she said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "When I look back, the first time, Dad was on a call. That was the month Corbin was dealing with his lease thing. The time with the pharmacy. Corbin needed something and they were picking it up for him on the way. I didn't know at the time. I pieced it together tonight." "You're sure?" "I'm sure of enough." She looked at the mug. "They have never once in 9 incidents been late because of something for themselves. It's always been him." Marshall's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at her, and she was aware, in the specific way that awareness sometimes arrives, late, complete, that his patience in this situation had been a form of love, and that she had been spending it for 2 years. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For—" She paused. "For how long this took me." He didn't say it's okay or don't worry about it, which she appreciated. He said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to change the arrangement permanently." She looked up at him. "I should have done it at 5. He held her gaze, and something passed between them that was neither absolution nor accusation, more like acknowledgement. The way two people look at each other when they've been carrying something together and are finally willing to say that it was heavy. "I'm also," she said, "going to talk to a school counselor. For Bria." Marshall nodded. "And I might talk to someone too." Another nod, this one slightly different, quieter, more private, like a thing he hadn't quite expected to feel. "Okay," he said. Just that. Outside, a car passed, and its headlights swept the ceiling briefly. Bria was asleep. The apartment was warm and still, and neither of them moved for a moment, sitting with the thing that had finally been brought into the room and allowed to take up the space it had actually been occupying for a year and a half. Spring arrived, and the arrangement ended. Selwyn had told her parents in a phone call, not a meeting, not a dinner, because she'd learned that in-person conversations with her family had a way of becoming her family's emotional needs absorbing her own. The phone gave her the ability to stay in her body, to remain the person who had decided something instead of the child who was always explaining herself. She'd said, "I'm making other arrangements for Bria's pickup. It's not about trust. It's about consistency. And Bria needs consistency." She'd said it clearly and without apology, which was hard. And she'd said it once, which was harder. Her mother had cried. Her father had become formal, which was his version of wounded dignity. Her brother, when he'd found out secondhand, had called to say that he didn't see why it had to be a whole thing, that nobody had meant any harm, and Selwyn had listened to him and said, "I know no one meant harm, and that's not what I'm making a decision about," and ended the call with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. She hired an after-school nanny 3 days a week, a college student named Freddie, who was reliable in the way that people are reliable when they are paid to be reliable and also happen to care. Bria liked her. Bria, who had been asking is Grandma definitely coming every Tuesday morning for almost a year, stopped asking. Selwyn noticed the absence of the question before she consciously registered what it meant. Marshall noticed her noticing. She stopped checking, Selwyn said one evening. Yes, she paused. That's both good and not good. I know. A 7-year-old shouldn't have had to develop that much management of expectations. Marshall was quiet for a moment. She's resilient. I know. I'm not comforted by that. He looked at her. No, you shouldn't be. Her mother had, by April, restructured the story. Selwyn had pieced this together through the specific second-hand channels that family information always travels. A cousin's offhand comment, a church friend of her mother's, who'd asked after Bria in a way that suggested she'd been told something. The version Diane told, as best Selwyn could reconstruct it, was one in which she and Gerald had stepped back from childcare responsibilities because Selwyn had become very particular about things, and it was probably best for everyone, and they supported whatever Selwyn felt she needed to do. There was no version, in her mother's telling, in which the tracking app had shown a blue dot at a furniture store on Kettler Road. Selwyn hadn't been surprised. She'd been something smaller and more specific than surprised, a feeling she didn't have a clean word for, somewhere between tired and known. She'd expected it. The expectation was its own kind of grief. Her father had called twice since the arrangement ended, both times about unrelated things. A question about Bria's birthday, a comment about a news story, and both calls had had the careful quality of a man maintaining contact without acknowledging anything. Selwyn had kept the calls short and warm. Not cold, she didn't want cold, but boundaried in a way that was new, that required effort, that left her slightly exhausted, and also in a way she couldn't explain. More like herself, she was seeing a therapist on Thursday evenings. She'd started in February and had spent the first 3 sessions explaining her parents in the specific detail of someone who loves difficult people and has been explaining them their whole life. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Nidia Ferreira, who had the ability to sit with silence without filling it, had eventually said, "You're very good at understanding them. Tell me about understanding yourself." She'd cried at that, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought she was past the part where she cried easily. Selwyn and Marshall went through their own quiet recalibration in those months. Not dramatic, not a crisis, but the slow and necessary work of 2 people who have been existing in parallel and are choosing, deliberately, to return to something shared. He'd started leaving work earlier on Wednesdays to be home for dinner. Not announced, just there. She'd started telling him, in small doses, what therapy was surfacing instead of saving it all for the drive home and then keeping it to herself anyway. They were not repaired in the way that stories sometimes imply people get repaired. They were instead more honest, which was harder and more durable. The 10th and 11th incidents existed. Technically, Selwyn had kept a record, part practical, part the habit of a woman who had learned that her memory of events would eventually be disputed. She kept it in a notes app, brief and factual with timestamps. She didn't look at it often. She looked at it occasionally, when she needed to remember that what she had understood was real, that the app had shown what it had shown, that the blue dot was on Kettler Road. She'd also consulted a family attorney in March, briefly, informatively, not from anger, but from the particular clarity that comes when you understand that documentation is not hostility, it's preparation. The attorney had said, "Good instincts. Keep the records. You may not need them, but you'll be glad you have them." She'd felt something sitting across from that attorney. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but a version of herself she'd been slow to meet. A woman who took the things seriously that required seriousness. She drove home from that appointment in the late afternoon light, and she stopped at the school to pick up Bria herself. And Bria came out of the building and saw her and ran. Not frantically, just the run of a child who is glad. And Selwyn crouched down in the parking lot and held her and felt, with a plainness that didn't require analysis, that this was what it had always been about. Just this. The conversation happened in September, after Bria's 2nd week of 3rd grade, on a Sunday afternoon when Selwyn's parents came for the dinner she'd been slowly, deliberately rebuilding, monthly, structured on her terms, with the specific shape of a thing she was choosing rather than inheriting. Gerald had been quieter than usual. Diane had brought a pie and commented on Bria's height and asked about Marshall's firm with the careful interest of someone who has been advised by whom Selwyn could guess to keep the afternoon smooth. Bria had taken her grandfather into the living room to show him something on her tablet, and Selwyn and her mother were in the kitchen, and the pie was on the counter. And for a few minutes they talked about nothing. The pie, the weather, a neighbor of Diane's who was moving. Then her mother said, "She seems happy." "She is," Selwyn said. "Freddie's working out. Very well." A pause. Diane was looking at the pie. "I want you to know," she said with the careful sound of a sentence that had been rehearsed, "that we never wanted Bria to feel." She stopped, searched. "We love her very much. I know you do. And we never intended, Mom." Selwyn turned from the counter and looked at her mother directly. Diane was 63 and had her daughter's eyes and the particular quality of a woman who had spent a lifetime being loving in ways that also served her, and who had never once examined the gap between the two. She looked right now, like someone hoping a moment would pass. "I know you didn't intend it." Her mother nodded, relieved. "But it happened," Selwyn said. Not loudly, not with the energy of someone who has stored this up. Just as a fact placed carefully between them, 11 times. And I have to trust that you understand that, and not just that it's over. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear her father's voice in the other room, low and patient, as he looked at whatever Bria was showing him. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We do understand." Selwyn looked at her mother and didn't know, fully, with certainty, whether that was true. She had spent most of her life extending credit in that direction, and she had learned this year that extending credit is not the same as extending trust. And trust was something she would rebuild with her parents slowly, in doses, in the same way she'd rebuilt things with herself, by watching what happened over time, by holding the record clearly, by not confusing someone's wish that a thing were different with evidence that it was. She said, "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness in the cinematic sense. It wasn't a door swinging open. It was a single word in a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon that meant, "I'm willing to see what comes next." No more than that, and no less. After dinner, after Selwyn's parents had gone and Bria was in the bath and Marshall was cleaning up, Selwyn stood at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hand and looked at the street. The September light was that specific pale gold that doesn't last, the kind that makes ordinary things look briefly significant. Marshall came and stood beside her. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. Like someone who's been carrying something and has put it down but can still feel where it was. He was quiet for a moment. "That goes away." "Does it?" "Mostly." She leaned slightly against him. Not dramatically, just a small closing of distance, the way two people do when they have been honest with each other and are willing to stay. He stayed. They looked at the street together, and the gold light shifted to gray in the way it does, and Bria called from the bathroom that the water was getting cold. Selwyn pushed off from the window and went to her. In the kitchen behind her, Marshall finished putting away the dishes from a dinner that had not been easy and had not been impossible, and had been, for the first time in a long time, exactly what she had chosen it to be. That was the whole of it. That was what she had built. Not the absence of damage, but the presence, quiet and insistent, of what she'd decided to keep.